And now, Chapter 11. Chapter 11. A fair, fine summer day found Quedrim with the other lords, along with the lady, leading the army along the road toward Dora. During the daylight, the armed column snaked its way along the roads, trailing a visible dust plume. During the evenings, the commanders worked out the plan Guathnarin had developed. This time, as last, Quedrim's main purpose would be to deal with the potterymen. Some 1,200 of them were now with Batlas's army. The other lords and contingent commanders in the army of Higfrid were still dubious, at best, about Guathnarin's refused rank formation. Quedrim recalled one of the recent discussions. "This business of holding back from battle," declared one lord, "it seems suspiciously like cowardice to me." "What foolishness is this?" demanded Guathnarin. "We are long past the days when every man charged forward to be the first to come to grips. We know that holding ranks and maintaining formation is the best way to fight. Why should a minor reordering of a battle line make a difference to who is brave and who is not?" "Well, but it's the look of the thing." "The look of the thing. If we go forward in line abreast, in perfect dressing, so no part of the line is before or behind the other, those potterymen will eat up our line before the forces on the other rank can come close to dealing with Batlas. And how will you like the look of that?" "I still do not care to be ordered to use a formation that displays fear of the enemy. Would you prefer me to order you to take command of the infantry reserve behind the line altogether?" The fellows subsided, but it was plain that they might be ready to use Guathnarin's new formation, but they were not at all willing. A party of horse archers, dusty and filthy, came riding up. "Lord Guathnarin, commander sent us back here because there is news which he felt best we should bring to you without delay." "Report." "Lord, the elephants, their drivers, do not ride out in the open. There is a box fitted on each of the elephants, and in it the driver sits, along with several archers. It may be difficult to get at the drivers, Lord." "Thank you for your report. Go find yourself something to drink, rest for a bit, and catch us up later." He said nothing until they were gone. "Well, it's too late to make great changes in our plans now. Our archers will just have to deal with the matter." "Lord Guathnarin?" "What do you want, Quedrim?" His voice said he had no time for idle talk. This news was serious. "You know I can hit a target as far away as I can see it. If you allow it, I can take a position on some hill or other and pick off the riders and all before they can get near enough to do any damage." "You could you?" "Come, Lord Guathnarin. Do you want me to prove it to you? Pick a mark, anything you want." The lady took a part then. "Lord Guathnarin, I'd suggest we take his offer. It might just make a bad situation a little less bad." Guathnarin looked at her, then nodded. "All right, then. Can you deal with the elephant riders and still have time to help at all against the potterymen?" "Now, there's a promise I wouldn't want to make. I'll do my best. Will that suffice?" "It will have to." 3 evenings later, they were camped across the valley from the dory. Even as unlearned as he was in military matters, Quedrim could see that the Grafradi would have trouble cleaving their way through the enemy ranks to get at Batlas. It seemed clear to the rest of them as well, given the expression on the commanders' faces. He was at the last-minute meeting in the evening when Guathnarin made rearrangements as to just which contingents would take station where. The silence, the lack of argument was very obvious. No one was happy with the situation, but no one had any notion of what to do about it. Guathnarin had taken a batch of pebbles and sods, lining them up according to how he expected the Grafradi to be arranged on the next day. He was lecturing on how they would deploy in order to have their rank refused when they met the army. He carefully avoided dwelling on the obvious tough fighting the forward flank would have, possibly hoping, Quedrim thought, that by his own force of will he could bring them through. "Old woman's apron, I wonder just what's in his mind for me." He opened his pouch and brought out 2 handfuls of stones, floating in the air in front of him. He put them into formation, a dozen of them in 3 ranks, and floated them to where Gothneren had depicted his formation on the ground. At a height of about 3 palm breadths, he let them fall. They smacked along the pebbles that marked the lines there, flinging them airy. Gothneren came to his feet, reaching for his sword. "Before you go chopping me, just think a moment of what I've proved. If you had something out there to mark the dory forces, I'd have dropped the stones there. Just think about it." Gothneren paused with his sword partly drawn, then slipped it back into his sheath. "You have a point? Make it then, and hurry. You have me supporting the forces facing the pottery men, which is all well and good. But suppose I were to drop a load of stones on the right flank first. The left flank is refused. The pottery men won't reach there right away, and I should have time to make an attack on the right, a serious attack, before I go to my post. If the right flank hits first, following the stones, they have a better chance at cutting their way through." "You want to show off more and more, don't you?" "Old woman's apron, I want us all to keep our heads attached to our necks. I don't give more than a clipped copper coin for you, save that all you know how to fight and how to arrange battles. But I want to save the lady. You call it showing off? Then so I am. The question is, do you want to prevent me from showing off, or do you want to win this battle?" Gothneren went still, his face pale, despite the ruddy firelight. "Sometimes you push hard, Quedrum, and beware you don't push too hard and too far." He took a deep breath. "I hope I am willing to see sense when it's rubbed in my face. You may well be right here. Throwing and dropping stones, this is still a new thing on any battlefield that I've seen, and I will admit I'm not altogether certain as to the best use to make of it. You feel certain you can do this and still get back to your assigned position in time?" "Fairly certain. I won't have to be directly behind the right flank. I think I can manage to do it from the center. After that, I rush to the left. I don't have to be directly behind the left either, though the farther over I get, the better. If we have an ox cart of stones stationed behind the left, I should be all right. They don't move very fast, but I can, so it makes more sense for me to move to them than them to move with me." The next day dawned bright and fair, and shortly after sunup, there was a shouting and clattering noise as the army of Higfrid fell into its ranks, drowning out whatever might have been heard of the dory doing the same thing across the way. Quedrum mounted up and took his position beside an ox cart. There'd be another such cart, if no one had messed things up too badly, off to his left. Now the advance began. At least the right wing, the phalanx, began to move forward, pikes held upright like a forest, a screen of light infantry and horse archers protecting its vulnerable right flank. The rest of the line adjusted its formation, each section moving just a little later, keeping a steady line, but one which trailed backward from the left flank of the phalanx. Quedrum determined this time, though, that nothing should distract him from his main purpose. He turned to watch the phalanx before him, moving along behind it, with the creaking ox cart following along. The dory line was advancing as well, a steady marching pace which when they were close enough, would change into a rush to come to grips, to push home with the pikes and drive the foemen off the field. Quedrum's own work would be a matter of judgment. He could see the latter dropped his stones. The later he dropped the stones, the less time the enemy would have to reorder his ranks. On the other hand, leaving it too late may well have some of the stones bounding over to disorder the Gifrati. Since it was not something he had been able to practice with, he was going to have to go by guess and good wishes. He pulled the stones from the ox cart, floating them in the air, arraying them into ranks. These were not the small sling stones he had used in the previous night. These were double fist to head-sized boulders. He lifted them up. Hope Gothneren had seen to it. These lot are expecting these stones to go overhead today, he thought. Just to be sure, he lifted them further, so the stones went well overhead, probably unnoticed by men focusing their attention on the enemy to the front. It might have been more effective to swoop the stones down in front of the enemy before making them climb enough that the drop would properly disrupt them. That would be adding just a bit too much flash to it, though, and he wasn't entirely sure he'd have time, how much time he'd have. So he just sent the rocks over the heads of the dory, some 10 feet up, and dropped them at what seemed the appropriate time. Given the distance and the angle from which he was watching, he told himself he'd done well. Best would have been to take out the front and second ranks, but though he missed the front rank, he had destroyed the second, and disordered the third for a good part of the 30-foot length his stones had covered. Not to mention that the rocks bounced off and toward the dory rear, which caused further disarray. Yes, he disordered the enemy phalanx, and they weren't going to be able to correct that disorder before the two forces hit. It was up to the soldiers now to make good on that small advantage. He turned his horse and rode down to the left's rear, hearing behind the metallic clash as the forces came together, the shouting and screaming. The elephants were coming, evenly spaced just in the front of the ranks of the potterymen. It occurred to him that he'd been thinking too much of one trick. Was a sling stone actually the best weapon here? He picked up a head-sized stone from the ground and sent it down at the enclosure on the back of the nearest elephant. Wood splinters flew, yellow in the sun. He kept control of this stone and smashed it into the enclosure again and once again. After the third time, the side of the enclosure was a wreck. Splintered slats hanging from the front and rear posts. He could see the driver, and only one sling stone was needed. The man fell off the sham beast, and the elephant stopped in its tracks. As he readied his stone to deal with the next, Quedrin wondered if this was the same sort of thing as those potterymen in Lac Vosta, who moved and fought along as their commander, Losabelson, was alive, and then stopped. It seemed a reasonable notion. The next elephant was almost at the ranks of the infantry already. However, in this case, he could see the pale blob of the driver's head, as he had boasted to Wagner. Anything he could see, he could hit. He used his sling this time. A moment later, that elephant as well had stopped. The third elephant was into Gofrati ranks already, and they were beginning to lose cohesion. The one sling stone that took the driver down as well. One sling stone took down that driver as well. Then, Quedrin looked at the last elephant. It was in the midst of the light infantry, stamping and smashing, and the ranks were already beginning to give. He killed the fourth driver, rendering the beast immobile. Too late. The Gofrati were already fleeing. Old woman's apron! I took on a bit too much, even for the wondrous thrower of stones, he thought to himself. He had to try. He brought a line of stones down from the near end of the force of potterymen, sending it as far as he could see through the dust. The stones bowled them all over, and the potterymen took their usual laborious time getting to their feet again. By the time he was ready to bring his stones back. He paused beside the stopped elephant, the one that had ruined the Gofrati line. The archers who had been inside the shelter on the beast's back had already jumped down and headed back through the ranks of the potterymen to something more like safety. Wielding his stones as fiercely as he could, he delayed the potterymen's advance, fighting them for every palm breadth of ground. Off in the dust somewhere to his left, he was fairly sure that at least some part of the Gofrati left flank was holding, though he realized this was much wishful thinking as anything. No dory were coming up to attack him from the left, which meant someone down there was still fighting. At least to his non-military mind it did. Abruptly, the elephant began to move. Batlas must have taken control of them, Quedrin thought. After his first start of fear, he realized the beast was not coming at him, but moving straight forward. Perhaps the control of the beast was not perfect, or perhaps all Batlas could do was get them moving, in the hope that it would cause some trouble and disorder over here. Whatever the reason, the beasts were soon gone, off to the Gofrati rear. Time enough to worry about them if they come back. The potterymen seemed able to direct their own fighting, at least to some degree, and they were the danger here. Blows still smashed some of them, Had Cassabano been wrong about Batlas and his deep plans, or had Batlas just been cutting corners to hurry at getting the pottery men made? In the manner of a certain slinger come talisman maker? Then, between one step and the next, the pottery men ceased fighting. Many of them were caught in the midst of staking a step and therefore off balance, and they fell. Some fell into their fellows, causing them to fall as well. Did that mean Batlas was dead, or just driven too far from the field? The next question was, how much of a victory would things be if chaos away over on this flank and Dory troops were coming up on the flank from behind? He went riding off to the rear, angling to the left, looking for any sign of Dory troops. He found them, light infantry, in the midst of plundering the Gafrati camp. Clearly they had no notion of how things had gone on the rest of the field, and clearly they had ceased to care. He wondered if their 10 commanders or 100 commanders had tried to call them to order, or they had just joined in the rest. Well, in any case, they might be a danger if the Carmista and her people came back here thinking the fight was won. Using his stones to strike from above, he attacked first one band, then another and another. If they had any sort of organization left, they might have surrounded him and killed him, or at least driven him off. But in this situation, with stones coming from the sky to strike them down, he began to head back on their own. They began to head back to their own lines in bits and clumps. Quedram then took his stones with him and headed back to the main line, where the main line had been. After riding some time, he found the place where the two phalanxes had come together. A row of stones marked that place, along with a near regular carpet of dead, some in Dory uniforms and some in Gafrati uniforms. Just beyond that, there were Dory dead, all of them facing back the way they'd come, obviously killed when they had fled. Eventually he came on the Carmista, cantering back in this direction, heavily guarded. We've won, then? The lady herself answered. Yes, Batlas is dead, and that is one task done. It is not up to me to answer for the left flank. But we were pretty bashed up over there. I wasn't able to stop the elephants as soon as I'd hoped. I'm sorry. Watheren seemed too tired to even accept this opportunity to criticize Quedram. Well, you kept them off our backs long enough. We'll have to spend a bit of time gathering our forces before we march again. Quedram apparently let something show in his expression, for Gwathnoran spoke again. What, you thought this is all over with? With this fight? The very next thing is to take the Dora city before some other of Batlas's underlings does so. We don't need any more trouble from that quarter. Gwathnoran organized a small advance force to march immediately on to Dora city and demand its surrender. He asked Quedram to be present when he reported to the lady. Then he said to the assembly, Scarce a contingent that hasn't lost heavy in this last one, but I'm getting together what I can. Quedram, would you accompany them? Perhaps give the city a further reason for surrender. I'll go, but demonstrations didn't seem to work well against the garrison at Higfrid. And the garrison at Higfrid knew that their lord was free and hoped he was gathering armies to fight again. This lot'll know Batlas is dead, and they'll have much less inducement to fight on. Just do what you can. This attitude, packing Quedram along as though he were an extra cloak which one might be of use, though everyone doubted it, put Quedram in a mood where, if they'd reached the city next day, he would have pulled the walls down, stone by stone. Marching with the army to the battlefield had been one thing. The forced march from the battlefield to Dora city was another. Quedram rode, but this meant only that the stress and pain on his backside rather than on his legs. On they went, over a hill and through valley, beginning a little earlier in the evening and halting a little later in the evening than was usual. The commander of the force was a gruff old lord by the name of Quibel. Though Quedram's rise had not aggravated Quibel as much as Silverdancer, for instance, he was still not quite so sure he wanted this person as a friend. Also, Quedram found that though he was with soldiers, he was not quite one of them. They all knew he was the man who threw stones around, and that he was a lord, with the favor of the Carmista. As everyone knew, it did not do to become too familiar with a lord. However, he had come to be a lord, and they seemed as though they were never sure when he would have a fit of anger and start throwing stones around. He wished that Thaldo had been one of the contingent picked for this march, but he hadn't been willing to face Guatherin with such a request. And besides, he thought, you didn't know you were going to be so lacking in company on this trip, did you? So he had no one to complain to regarding his aching backside, and by the time they had halted below the city's walls, he was heartily sick of the whole business. He hadn't pulled down Lockbuster's wall nor Higfred's, because in those cases it had been highly likely the walls would be needed soon after. This time, as near as Quedrum could tell, the war was pretty much over, and Higfred was still whole, so there seemed no need to preserve Dara City. So the herald called the city to surrender. People of Dara, your lord Butlas is defeated and slain. We call you to surrender in the name of Lady Anavristi, Carmista of Higfred. There was a time of silence, and then a voice called down, No, we will not surrender. Anyone who can come claiming to that sort of news, it will not make it true. Ha! The herald muttered. I'll wager they've heard the news from other fugitives already. They're just hoping to get preferential terms. I'll warn them, then you can start your demonstration. Quedrum grabbed the herald's sleeve. No, I think it would be better if I go after them with no warning. This isn't the usual procedure. Quedrum was in no mood for drawn-out formalities. I don't give a badly clipped copper for the usual procedure. Get out of the way. The first thing he did was pull several stones down off of the stretch of the top of the wall just beside the gates they were facing, wrenching them off and letting them fall where they might have served the purpose. But instead, he wrenched them off and brought them down carefully and landed them in a pyramid stack in front of the wall. Now, call them to surrender, and if they won't, I'll dump their whole Morrigan wall on them. People of Dora, the herald called the herald, you have undoubtedly heard the tales of the Lord Quedrum, who has the power to command stones. You have no doubt thought them to be mere tales, but now you see they are altogether true. Lord Quedrum is out of patience. He gives you one more opportunity to surrender, lest he take your walls and bury your city under them. A voice called from the city, a somewhat fearful voice this time. What are the conditions does the Carmista of Higfred offer? And the herald answered, The lady declares that all the garrison may march out, and once they have stacked their arms, they may go where they will. There will be no sacking nor plundering of the city, nor its inhabitants. The city shall pay an indemnity of 1,000 gold coins, or the equivalent value in silver. No man, noble or common, who served the Carmost shall suffer, save that certain nobles, to be named, shall pay a sum of 100 silver coins. All nobles within the city shall make themselves known to the commander of the lady's garrison, who may, at his discretion, set them free on their spoken word to pay the agreed fee. These are the lady's terms. And more hoary and easy ones, too, muttered Quibble. Quedrum had to agree with that. He'd heard of instances where cities were given over to plunder for some time, and every adult male required to ransom himself and his family or be sold into slavery, with nobles requiring huge sums in ransom, again with slavery the penalty for default. He was sure that, terms of surrender notwithstanding, for the first few weeks, no citizen would have such recourse if some soldier decided he wanted some particular thing, be it valuable or trivial. Of course, there would always be a soldier or three who misjudged this free period and ended up suddenly surprised to find themselves accused of and guilty of theft. After a short silence, the answering voice from the wall said, We require another condition, that a limited number of troops be allowed within the city at one time. The commander grimaced. The lady had given him wide latitude as to terms he might accept, and this was near enough being beyond what he should allow. He shrugged. Let them save some pride by dictating one item to us. We agree. So the herald shouted down to the spokesman on the walls that the commander accepted the stipulation. There was another long wait. Then the city's gate opened, and the soldiers of the garrison began to march out and stack their arms. The state of affairs in Dora settled into what might be described as a long holding of breath. Surrender had been negotiated on certain terms, some of which could not be met until the lady arrived. It was not totally unknown for a surrendered city to suddenly find that the victors had nullified some or all of the conditions under which it had surrendered, and it required many things which the negotiators had forsworn, such as plundering and selling prominent citizens into slavery. Quadrim did not believe this would not be the case with the lady. She would go by her word, even if her word had been spoken by a subordinate's mouth in her name. Of course, the people of the city did not have that sort of assurance. On Quabille's advice, Quadrim did not go around the city alone. There's likely to be 1 or 2 dozen out there who don't like the thought of being ruled by foreigners. Some of them might be brave enough, with or without a skinful of wine, to try and take it out on one of the foreigners who happens to wander alone in their sight. I know I'm not letting my men go out, except in groups of 3 at least. I'll take your word for it. This meant that, given the attitudes of the men to himself, Quadrim did not go out much at all. This, in turn, meant that Quadrim's mood had not improved greatly by the time the rest of the army came in. One of the first things he did was go out in Malsanto's company to sample wine shops. Jenna Labis was back in the healer's tents on the battlefield. It was a bad poke he took, but it didn't get his gut, so he'll likely be all right. Malsanto gave Quadrim a look of concern. Should you be drinking like that? I don't know. Do you know any way I can drink faster? Malsanto frowned. You know, I believe the preferred manner is to drink slowly enough to enjoy the sensation of the whole world beginning to fall into proper alignment, rather than simply swallowing the wine until one passes out. A very pretty speech indeed. I've just spent the last year or so, it seems, either in the company of soldiers who are afraid I'll bring down the wrath of the Carmista on them, or drop boulders on their empty noggins, or in the company of people who hate me because I'm a foreigner who's invaded their city. And that makes the situation even more puzzling, then, because now that matters are changed, your good friends, one of them at least, is here, and now you want to go drink yourself into a stupor? And my most noble friend is trying to make me talk instead of drinking. I find this at least a little upsetting, to say the least. Despite this, he moderated his drinking. I don't suppose you'd favor me with the true story of how you brought the city to surrender. The tale I've been hearing is that you dropped most of the city walls on its citizens' heads. This is obviously untrue because the walls are still standing, mostly, and there doesn't seem to be any great lack of citizens around. Ha! The whole thing was because of my backside. Malsanto frowned at him in puzzlement. How does that work out? Well, you know, we force marched all the way here, didn't you? So by the time we arrived, my backside was sore from the long ride. So sore, I'm not sure it'll ever be right. So when the herald called them to surrender and they refused, I was very close to pulling down their walls and dropping the rocks on them. What I did, though, was pull a whole lot of stones from the front wall, overlooking the gate, pulled them down and stacked them very carefully in plain sight of the wall. He smiled slightly at the memory. I think I must have convinced them we weren't going to fool around with any sieging or storming, and that their walls weren't going to do them much good. So the herald called them to surrender, and they asked the terms. Then they put in one little condition about limiting the number of soldiers that were in the city at one time, and Quabille had agreed on behalf of the lady. And that was it. Malsanto shook his head. Quadroon, you may have all the stones in the world, but you certainly can't tell a story. You should brag a bit. God knows you have the right. Quadroon shook his head. Just isn't me, Malsa. Bragging just brings people to look at you, think about you like a target. Even as he said it, Quadroon remembered a good deal of his life had been like that. Bragging, making himself a target, then having to dig like mad to get out from under. I wonder if that blonde fellow is still back there in Higfrid. I wonder if he'd even recognize me anymore, being as high class as I am. So what are you thinking about now, Quadroon, with that faraway look in your face? Quadroon shook his head. Just remembering myself back in the days when I wasn't a lord and all. You wouldn't have liked me back then, Malsa. Have a good night, and I'll talk to you again soon.